Why are we paying her so much? The new VP scoffed as he suddenly reworked my role without consulting the board. I had clearly warned them about one specific, crucial clause in my contract, but legal brushed it aside. By the next morning, the company had lost $1.5 billion. Have you ever been blindsided by pure, unadulterated arrogance? I was, the day a hotshot new VP called my 14 years of expertise bloated legacy spending, right before he tried to fire me. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't just ending my job. He was about to trigger a corporate implosion so spectacular, it would cost them $1.5 billion. It all started innocently enough. Or, as innocently as things get when your multi-million-dollar compensation package is being dissected in a glass-walled executive suite. I was just grabbing coffee, mug halfway to my lips, when my new vice president of strategic operations, Carter Wells, decided to put on a show. He was holding court for our chief financial officer, board members, even our recently installed CEO, Lydia Vance. And guess what was on the massive projection screen behind him? My salary. My exact salary. $685,000 annually, plus benefits and deferred bonuses from 14 years of meticulous work. Carter, this 34-year-old wunderkind with a Wharton MBA, a stint at McKinsey, and a career built on corporate restructuring, had been at Crest Global Solutions for exactly 7 weeks. He had that supreme confidence of someone who'd only ever dismantled things, never actually built them. Are we seriously paying someone this much to babysit spreadsheets? He sneered, gesturing at my numbers like they were evidence of a crime. He called it bloated legacy spending, hemorrhaging resources, on positions that made sense in 2010, but are completely redundant today. I just stood there, motionless, watching the whole performance unfold. I'd seen this corporate theater before at 3 other companies, but this time the blade wasn't aimed at some other department. This time it was coming straight for me. What Carter, and frankly none of them in that room knew, was that 4 years earlier, when Vanguard Capital Partners acquired Crest, my attorney and I had buried a very specific, very powerful secret weapon deep in my employment agreement. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D. It was a contingency plan, something I'd even sent a detailed memo about just 19 days prior to legal counsel, HR, and executive leadership. Their response? A dismissive received. We'll review and follow up as needed. No follow-up ever came. HR probably filed it under procedural noise. And now, watching Carter circle my compensation like a predator eyeing vulnerable prey, I finally understood. They were about to discover precisely what happens when new management ignores institutional warnings. By tomorrow, Crest wasn't just going to eliminate a redundant position. They were about to trigger a contractual cascade that would unravel everything. $1.5 billion in client withdrawals, regulatory exposure, accelerated compensation, and penalty provisions that would fundamentally alter their entire financial future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's actually start at the beginning. My name is Tinsley Drake, and 6 months ago, I was the Senior Director of Risk Architecture and Regulatory Compliance. Yeah, I know, it's not exactly a thrilling dinner party conversation starter. People's eyes tend to glaze over when I explain what I actually do. But that title? That was the invisible shield protecting a multi-billion-dollar company from catastrophic federal enforcement actions. I'm 43, studied economics at Columbia, then earned my law degree from NYU while working full-time. I even spent 6 years at the SEC, becoming an expert in the exact regulatory frameworks that keep financial services companies from imploding under federal scrutiny. Crest recruited me in 2011, desperate for someone who understood the new Dodd-Frank landscape that was reshaping the industry. My husband Jacob, he's a structural engineer. He builds bridges. Our son Logan, he's in his sophomore year at Cornell. Between his tuition, our Brooklyn Heights brownstone, and the comfortable life we'd built over 2 decades of dual professional incomes, my $685,000 package wasn't excessive. It was fair compensation for someone who designed and maintained the invisible infrastructure keeping a multi-billion-dollar company compliant with 23 different regulatory bodies across federal, state, and international jurisdictions. My work wasn't about splashy headlines or closing big deals. I didn't manage profit and loss statements or pitch new clients. I designed and maintained the complex compliance architecture that allowed everything else to function. SEC regulations, FINRA oversight, state banking commissioners, international data privacy, anti-money laundering protocols, consumer protection statutes, each with its own specific requirements, reporting schedules, and enforcement philosophies. I knew which specific examiner at which particular agency cared about what compliance markers. I knew which regulations had real teeth and which were just performative box-checking exercises. My systems ensured that when regulatory auditors showed up for surprise examinations, every document they requested was already organized, cross-referenced, and bulletproof. That knowledge isn't easily transferred. It's not a training manual. It's pattern recognition, built over 19 years of watching regulatory environments shift, understanding how enforcement priorities change with political administrations, and cultivating relationships with the actual decision-makers who determined whether your company faced a warning letter or a $50 million penalty. Crest's client base, 63 institutional investors collectively managing $1.2 trillion in assets, like pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds. They didn't tolerate even the appearance of regulatory uncertainty. They bought our analytics, sure, but what they really bought was our compliance reputation. A reputation that rested almost entirely on the frameworks I designed, the relationships I'd cultivated, the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated over 14 years. None of this registered as valuable to Carter Wells when he arrived last October, or to our new CEO, Lydia Vance. She joined 8 months earlier after the Vanguard acquisition and came from a pure tech background. She spoke fluently in the language of operational efficiency and scalable systems. She spoke of legacy cost structures and modernization initiatives, but had zero deep understanding of financial services regulatory complexity. Carter was her chosen weapon, her vision for transforming what she repeatedly called our antiquated operational model. I first encountered him during an all-hands operations meeting. He stood there impeccably tailored, radiating that kind of confidence that comes from never having experienced significant professional failure. His presentation slide? Operational excellence through strategic transformation. He declared he'd done a comprehensive operational audit and found significant opportunity for structural improvement and cost rationalization. He talked enthusiastically about AI and automation, and then showed slides comparing our compliance expenditures to carefully selected industry benchmarks that often came from companies either facing huge penalties or too new to have real scrutiny. Substantially overstaffed in certain legacy functions, he announced, scanning the assembled employees with practiced concern. Not because anyone has underperformed, but because our operational approach hasn't evolved. Afterwards, he cornered me near the elevator. "Tinsley, correct?" he said, extending his hand with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'd like to schedule time. Detailed discussion about your department. Bring comprehensive documentation. I want to understand what can be automated and what truly requires human judgment." My first clear warning signal. But I'd survived 4 acquisitions, 6 different CEOs, and countless reorganization initiatives. I knew how to document value. I knew how to demonstrate necessity. I wasn't particularly concerned. In retrospect, that was incredibly naive. The meeting happened the following Thursday in his freshly renovated, minimalist office. "Walk me through why regulatory compliance requires this level of investment," he challenged. For 50 minutes, I patiently explained the landscape, the jurisdictional complexity, the relationship management with 37 different agency contacts, the customized reporting frameworks for clients, the audit preparation protocols that had kept us violation-free and penalty-free for 11 consecutive years. He nodded periodically, took notes on his tablet, asked questions that at first seemed thoughtful, but gradually revealed his complete ignorance of our operational reality. "Couldn't the majority of this monitoring be handled through RegTech platforms?" he asked, dismissively. "I've been briefed on several vendors offering AI-driven compliance solutions at a small fraction of current personnel costs." I explained calmly, "Those platforms are useful tools, Carter, effective for data aggregation. But regulatory compliance isn't simply about checking boxes. It requires judgment calls in gray areas where regulations overlap. It requires relationship management when issues arise that need contextual discussion. It requires institutional knowledge about how different regulators prioritize concerns based on current enforcement trends. He wanted a concrete example. So I gave him one. Last year, we identified a data reporting anomaly with one of our pension fund clients, the Ohio State Teachers Retirement System. The raw numbers in their filings technically met regulatory requirements. But I noticed a pattern inconsistency, suggesting a calculation error in their upstream vendor systems, not in our data. An automated system would have flagged everything as compliant. Instead, I called their chief compliance officer directly, walked them through my analysis. We discovered a vendor integration problem that would have cascaded into a substantial risk of violation within 90 days. They were so grateful. They renewed their contract for 4 years and upgraded their service tier, adding $18 million annually to our revenue. More importantly, it solidified our reputation in the public pension fund market, leading to 3 more client acquisitions. Carter just wrote another note. Interesting case study. But is that approach sustainable as we scale operations? Sustainable. That became his favorite word. Over the following weeks, every conversation, every email, every casual interaction in the hallway eventually circled back to whether my role, my team, my entire operational approach was sustainable, given the company's evolution toward what he termed modern efficiency standards. I started documenting everything meticulously. Every question he posed, every suggestion he made, every hint that my position was being evaluated not for its performance, but for its cost reduction opportunities. In mid-November, I had lunch with Emily Chandler, an old colleague who'd recently left a competitor. Their compliance director was let go during a restructuring. "Let me guess the pattern," Emily said after I described Carter. "New executive, consulting background, thinks regulatory compliance is basically a software subscription you can purchase instead of actual expertise." "Essentially accurate," I confirmed. Emily said they replaced their director with a less experienced manager and a $200,000 RegTech platform. "Want to know what happened last month?" she asked. FINRA showed up for a routine spot examination. They found 23 documentation gaps, 9 reporting inconsistencies, and 3 potential material violations. We're now facing 8-figure penalties. Plus, we've lost 3 major institutional clients who cited compliance concerns in their termination letters. Their old director had warned them during her exit interview, documented every risk. They didn't care. They saved $450,000 on her salary. Now they face $30 million in fines, $60 million in lost revenue. I drove back to the office, the pattern horrifyingly clear. Organizations that mistake cost-cutting for strategic efficiency. That night, I pulled out my employment contract from our home office file cabinet. For the first time in 4 years, I read it carefully. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D. Practically leaped off the page. This was Claire Holloway, my attorney, at her best during the Vanguard acquisition. Vanguard's due diligence team had identified me as a key person risk. This clause was their protective mechanism, ensuring that if my institutional knowledge disappeared suddenly, there would be financial consequences substantial enough to discourage careless management decisions. It specified that if my position was eliminated or materially restructured without specific protocols, including a 240-day transition period, formal board approval, documented risk mitigation plans, and client notification procedures, it would trigger automatic acceleration of all my deferred compensation, invested equity grants, and performance bonuses accumulated over the life of my employment. More critically, it included penalty provisions if my departure caused client contract disruptions. Many of our largest institutional clients had contractual continuity clauses, allowing them to exit agreements without penalty if senior compliance personnel changed improperly. I had warned Vanguard about these complexities during the acquisition. They built these protections because they understood the financial cost of losing concentrated institutional knowledge. But that was 4 years ago. New leadership, new priorities, new managers who hadn't been there, and apparently hadn't bothered to read the documents. On November 18th, I drafted and sent a formal memo. Subject: Compliance Role Restructuring, Contractual Considerations, and risk assessment. I explicitly quoted Article 12, Section 7, subsection D. I detailed client contract implications, attached a spreadsheet of affected clients. I included a comprehensive risk assessment projecting potential exposure if my role was eliminated without following the contractual protocols. Carter responded within 90 minutes via email. Thanks for the input. We'll take this under advisement as we finalize our operational planning. Simon Foster, our general counsel, sent a separate message. Tinsley, I'll review the contractual language with our outside counsel and coordinate with HR. Appreciate you flagging this. That was it. No follow-up meeting, no detailed review session. Just a quick acknowledgement and then silence. 3 weeks later, I received a calendar invite. Strategic Workforce Planning Session. Executive Conference Room. All Leadership. December 6th. I knew immediately what it was. This wasn't a collaborative discussion about organizational development. It was a carefully scripted termination event with witnesses present to document that proper procedures were followed. The night before, I was in my home office in Brooklyn, reviewing my comprehensive documentation folder. Jacob came in around 10:30 p.m., carrying tea. "You're still working," he observed, setting the mug on my desk. He'd overheard enough of my phone conversations with Claire to understand something significant was developing. "The workforce planning session?" I confirmed. "Are they planning to terminate you?" "That appears to be the likely outcome." He sat in the chair across from me, his engineering mind already processing scenarios. "Tinsley will manage financially. You'll find another position easily. Your reputation in the industry is exceptional." "I know we'll be fine," I said. "But this isn't primarily about finding another position. This is about them understanding what they're actually eliminating." I showed him the contract language, walked him through the exposure calculations Claire had prepared, explained the client contract implications in detail. Jacob read through everything silently, his expression shifting from concern to something resembling amazement. "They really didn't review any of this?" he said finally. "The new leadership team, they weren't part of the original acquisition negotiations. Carter has been here less than 2 months. Lydia came from a completely different industry. They see numbers on a spreadsheet representing cost, not the systems that actually protect those numbers from regulatory catastrophe." "So what happens tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow?" I said, a quiet certainty in my voice. "They learn what expensive actually means." I arrived at the office the next morning at 8:45 a.m. The executive conference room, all glass and steel, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Lower Manhattan. A beautiful setting for what was essentially a corporate execution. Lydia Vance was at the head of the table, her expression professionally neutral. Carter Wells, laptop already connected. Simon Foster, our general counsel, reviewing documents on his tablet with unusual intensity. 3 Vanguard board observers, including Elizabeth Hartwell, a sharp-eyed woman who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions during quarterly reviews. Even our CFO, Wyatt Cooper, looked distinctly uncomfortable, adjusting his tie repeatedly, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Carter stood, activated his presentation. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this important workforce optimization session." The usual corporate jargon. As we approach year-end planning, it's essential we examine our organizational structure with fresh perspective. The first slide appeared, operational excellence through strategic restructuring. Then the next, departmental expense breakdown. Regulatory compliance was 31% of operational overhead, highlighted in bright red. And right there, an arrow pointing specifically to my position. And my compensation. "Now, I want to be absolutely clear," Carter continued, his tone carefully modulated for maximum reasonableness. "This discussion isn't about individual performance or historical contributions. Tinsley Drake has been a valued team member throughout her tenure. Has been, not is, the deliberate past tense. It hung in the air. However, compliance technology has advanced substantially. Automated platforms can now handle regulatory monitoring with 99.7% accuracy, at a fraction of current personnel costs. Another slide appeared, Compliance Modernization Roadmap. Phase 3, Legacy Role Transition. Estimated annual savings, $740,000. No name listed, but everyone in the room knew exactly which position that represented. Elizabeth Hartwell, the Vanguard board observer, spoke up, her voice measured. What's the transition timeline here? And what risk mitigation protocols are being implemented? Excellent questions, Carter replied smoothly. We're proposing a 90-day knowledge transfer period to our newly hired compliance manager, with full transition to automated monitoring systems by March 1st. 90 days, not the 240 days my contract explicitly required. Simon Foster raised his hand, slightly, tentatively. Have we conducted a comprehensive review of the contractual implications of this restructuring? Carter, brimming with confidence, waved it off. HR has confirmed that all employment agreements include standard at-will termination provisions. This is a legitimate business efficiency decision fully within our operational authority. Standard provisions. He clearly hadn't read Article 12, Section 7, subsection D. Or he had and completely dismissed its implications. Any other questions before we move to implementation specifics? Carter asked, scanning the room with practiced confidence. I could have stayed silent. Let them finish their presentation, sign their paperwork, congratulate themselves on their decisive leadership and operational efficiency. But sometimes the most effective tactical response is the one no one sees coming. I stood up slowly, reached into my portfolio, and placed a sealed envelope directly in front of Lydia Vance. I'd like to save everyone considerable time and legal expense, I said, my voice completely calm. The room went absolutely silent. Carter's confident expression flickered momentarily. Lydia tried to regain control of the meeting. Tinsley, there's no need for theatrical gestures. We haven't even discussed the transition support package and severance arrangement yet. I ignored her. I removed my building access badge and security credentials, placing them on top of the envelope. The plastic hitting the wood made a sharp, echoing sound in the silent room. Inside that envelope, I continued, looking directly at Lydia, is my resignation, effective immediately. Also included is a copy of Article 12, Section 7, subsection D of my employment agreement, along with a detailed analysis prepared by my attorney regarding contractual exposure and client contract implications. I believe your legal team will want to review this material very carefully and very quickly. Simon Foster was already reaching for the envelope. He tore it open, scanned the first page, then flipped to the contract excerpt. I watched his face, transformed. His eyes widened incrementally, his jaw tightened, color drained slightly from his cheeks. Lydia's voice was sharp now, the professional neutrality cracking. What does it say? Simon looked from Carter to Elizabeth Hartwell, then back at the documents in his hand. It's a key person protection clause, he said, his voice barely a whisper. If Tinsley's role is terminated or materially restructured without a 240-day transition period and formal board approval, it triggers immediate acceleration of all deferred compensation, invested equity grants, and performance bonuses accumulated over her entire tenure. The room went completely, unnervingly quiet. Only the subtle hum of the building's HVAC system. Wyatt Cooper, the CFO, finally spoke, his voice strained. How much acceleration are we discussing? Simon, his finger tracing lines of text with increasing concern. Read on. 14 years of deferred performance bonuses, indexed to client retention metrics and company valuation. Equity adjustments tied to the Vanguard acquisition terms. Plus, he paused, reading more carefully, plus, penalty provisions if her departure causes client contract disruptions. Several major institutional clients have termination rights if senior compliance personnel change, without proper notification and approval. Carter, he had gone visibly pale. That wasn't included in the HR summary documentation, he stammered. Simon looked up, his voice quiet, almost cold. HR doesn't review executive protection clauses. Those are negotiated directly during acquisitions and maintained by legal counsel. They're not part of standard employment documentation. I pushed my chair back from the table. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute here, I said, with a finality that echoed through the room. I wish everyone stability and success in the coming months. As I walked toward the door, I heard Lydia's voice, tight and controlled now. Simon, what's our total exposure here? Give me a preliminary number. I didn't wait for his answer. The door clicked shut behind me. Felt remarkably, deliciously final. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone was buzzing insistently. 6 missed calls from office numbers I recognized. I ignored them. There's a specific window after a decision like that. Too early for consequences to fully materialize. Too late for prevention. I sat in my Lexus for a few minutes, looking back at that glass and steel tower, housing 940 employees who had no idea what was about to hit them. Then, I pulled out my personal phone and called Jacob. Hey, he said, his voice warm, probably between project meetings. I resigned. I told him simply. You okay? He asked. Yes, better than okay, actually. Can you leave work early today? I think we should discuss what happens next before this becomes a media story. Jacob got nervous. Tinsley, you're making me nervous. What's happening? Nothing to be nervous about, I assured him. Just, things are about to get very complicated at Crest, and I want you to understand the complete picture before it hits the business press. I drove home through Manhattan, in an unusual silence. No music, no podcast. Just the quiet anticipation of watching a carefully constructed system execute exactly as designed. I didn't need to be in that conference room to know what was unfolding. Legal teams don't panic visibly or dramatically. They panic methodically, with spreadsheets, with liability assessments, with urgent calls to outside counsel. Simon would be pulling contract files, calling Vanguard's legal team, running exposure calculations that only worsened with each iteration. That afternoon, my former colleague, Aidan Brooks, texted me from his personal phone. Emergency legal meeting. All senior leadership. What the hell did you do? I just texted back. Read my contract. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D. His reply, holy shit. By 6 p.m., the first client inquiry had arrived at Crest's general compliance inbox. Not to me, but to them. The New York State Common Retirement Fund, managing $268 billion in assets, asking a straightforward question. Who was now certifying their quarterly regulatory filings under the protocols established in their master service agreement? There was no answer available. Nobody else at Crest held those specific certifications. My replacement would need a minimum of 24 months of training, examination, and supervised experience to achieve comparable credentials, assuming they could even find someone with the right combination of legal background, regulatory experience, and institutional knowledge. Another inquiry followed within an hour from the California State Teachers Retirement System, asking if their contractual continuity provisions were still satisfied under the new compliance structure. Those provisions, buried in an 800-page master service agreement, referenced my specific functional role and certifications explicitly. Not my name, but the position. At 9:03 p.m., my attorney Claire called. Tinsley, I've been reviewing the situation as it's developing. This Article 12 provision is executing exactly as written. I know, I said. Are you prepared for full enforcement? The exposure calculation is going to be substantial. What are the current preliminary numbers? I heard paper shuffling on her end. Direct compensation acceleration, if triggered immediately, approximately $11.4 million. But that's before secondary cascade effects. Secondary effects? I prompted. Client contract clauses. 7 of your largest institutional clients have termination rights if you leave without proper transition protocols. I'm seeing potential exposure in the hundreds of millions if this cascades through their entire client portfolio. Inside Crest, Carter was likely arguing with anyone who would listen that I had resigned voluntarily, that nothing had technically been terminated, that contract language could be interpreted flexibly depending on circumstances. But contracts don't interpret themselves based on desired outcomes. They execute based on clear, unambiguous triggers. Triggers written precisely to prevent the kind of flexible interpretation Carter was likely advocating. The clause wasn't punitive in intent. It was protective. Designed during the Vanguard acquisition because their due diligence had revealed a dangerous concentration of institutional knowledge in my specific role. If that role ended without proper protocols, automatic safeguards activated to compensate for the disruption. By midnight Friday, their finance team ran initial exposure scenarios. By Monday morning, they ran them again, with expanded parameters. Each iteration revealed additional contractual linkages and cascade effects nobody had anticipated. What their analysis discovered was a network effect. My role wasn't operationally isolated. It was referenced directly or indirectly in continuity provisions across multiple high-value client agreements. These agreements had cross-default language. Disruption in one contractual area created leverage in others. The New York State Common Retirement Fund, for instance, had a clause allowing asset withdrawal without penalty if their designated compliance contact was removed without 240 days notice and documented board approval. Their account generated $185 million annually in service fees. California's state teachers' retirement system had similar language, triggered by changes to senior compliance personnel. Their exposure? $290 million annually. When you build systems specifically designed to survive regulatory stress and institutional scrutiny, those same systems become unforgiving when stress is introduced artificially by careless management decisions. Friday afternoon, Lydia called me. From her personal cell phone. "Tinsley, we need to talk. This situation has escalated significantly." "I'm listening," I said calmly. "Legal counsel is projecting total exposure that could exceed 9 figures if institutional clients start exercising termination rights under their continuity clauses. This goes far beyond your individual compensation." "That seems like a reasonable projection," I replied, "based on the contractual architecture." A long pause. "Is there any way to resolve this? Some kind of arrangement that satisfies the contractual requirements while minimizing disruption?" I was sitting in our living room, watching the afternoon light filter through the windows of our quiet Brooklyn street. A normal Friday afternoon in our neighborhood, while downtown Manhattan was probably in complete crisis mode. "Lydia," I said, "the contract language is extremely specific. Once triggered, it resolves through either full execution of all provisions or through litigation. There's no middle ground or negotiated compromise built into the structure." "What would full execution look like?" she asked. "Complete acceleration of all deferred compensation, plus applicable penalties, plus whatever client attrition occurs naturally from the disruption. And that assumes you can prevent the worst cascade scenarios in litigation. Litigation would freeze all affected client accounts pending resolution, trigger additional default clauses across multiple agreements, and likely involve SEC oversight since it affects public pension fund assets and fiduciary responsibilities. You'd also be litigating against me while simultaneously trying to reassure institutional clients your compliance infrastructure is stable. That's not a sustainable position." Another long, heavy pause. "Tinsley, how did we miss this? How did this not come up in our planning process?" I chose my words carefully. "You didn't miss it, Lydia. You were warned explicitly in writing 3 weeks ago. You chose not to take it seriously." After I ended the call, Jacob came into the living room. "That was Lydia." "Yes. What did she want?" "To know if there's a way out that doesn't involve full contractual execution." "Is there?" I showed him the contract language again, the updated exposure calculations Claire had sent that afternoon. "Only one way out," I said. "Pay everything that's contractually owed, and hope institutional clients don't exercise their termination rights anyway." By Monday morning, their finance team had finalized preliminary exposure calculations. $1.5 billion in combined projected exposure. Not theoretical anymore. This represented a material recalculation of Crest Global Solutions' entire enterprise value. The board convened an emergency session Monday evening. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I could envision it clearly. A closed conference room, catered dinner no one touched. The slow, uncomfortable realization settling over everyone present. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a contractual execution. They had triggered it themselves. Elizabeth Hartwell from Vanguard would have asked the obvious question. How did we miss this during our operational oversight? The answer was straightforward. They hadn't missed it during the original acquisition. They'd built these protections specifically because they understood the risk. But new management had ignored that institutional memory. Carter reportedly argued until his voice failed, claiming the clause was excessive, unintentional, that nobody could have reasonably predicted this magnitude of exposure. But Simon didn't argue back. He didn't need to. Contracts don't care about intention or reasonableness. They care about execution. The call came Wednesday evening. William Ashford, Vanguard's managing partner, a man whose name rarely appeared in public, but whose decisions shaped billions in private equity investments. Tinsley, thank you for taking my call. His voice was measured, professional, utterly devoid of emotion. I've been thoroughly briefed on the situation. The board recognizes there were substantial failures in how this restructuring was handled. Substantial failures. The corporate euphemism for catastrophic miscalculation. We'd like to resolve this efficiently, he continued, in a manner that reflects your contributions appropriately and minimizes disruption to our clients and investors. My attorney has outlined the terms required for contractual resolution, I stated calmly. Yes, we've reviewed them carefully, he said. One question. If we execute full settlement within the contractual parameters, does the client cascade stop? Or do we face additional defections regardless? Fair question. Respected his directness. If executed within the contractual window, and properly communicated to affected clients with appropriate reassurances, yes, all continuity provisions can be satisfied. You'll need to hire replacement expertise quickly and implement proper transition protocols. But the contractual triggers can be resolved. We'll proceed then. The next 72 hours moved faster than the previous month combined. Credit facilities adjusted. Internal communications carefully drafted and reviewed by 3 separate law firms. External announcements prepared for clients and regulators. Carter Wells's name stopped appearing on company-wide communications. He wasn't terminated. That would create additional exposure and potential wrongful termination claims. Instead, he was transitioned to an advisory role supporting special strategic projects. Corporate purgatory. When the final settlement paperwork was executed Friday morning, Claire sent a text. Executed in full. Client cascade contained. Congratulations on the outcome. I was in my kitchen drinking coffee, reading the New York Times business section. Jacob had already left for a project site in New Jersey. Logan, home for winter break, was still asleep upstairs. A normal Friday morning in Brooklyn, while downtown Manhattan was processing an $11.4 million settlement to avoid a $1.5 billion catastrophe. Victory isn't loud or dramatic when it's earned through careful preparation and strategic patience. There was no celebration, just quiet satisfaction. Meticulous planning met opportunity. Exactly as designed. Within 10 days, discreet messages started arriving through my professional network. Not from recruiters or headhunters, but from managing partners, chief investment officers, board chairs. People who understood exactly what had happened without needing detailed explanations. They didn't ask why I'd left Crest. They asked what I could build for them. One conversation stood out distinctly. Lauren Montgomery, founding partner at Sovereign Risk Advisors in Boston. We spoke for nearly 3 hours on a Tuesday morning while I sat in our home office. Tinsley, she said, we don't need you to recreate what you did at Crest. We need you to design what comes next. Regulatory complexity is accelerating faster than most firms can adapt. We want to be ahead of that curve rather than constantly reacting. What kind of organizational structure are you envisioning? Senior partner, equity stake, complete autonomy to build my team and client relationships. And Tinsley, she paused meaningfully, your compensation package gets designed by you, reviewed by our partnership committee, but never questioned by someone who thinks institutional knowledge is a line item to eliminate. That was it. That represented understanding. For weeks later, Jacob and I flew to Boston for the contract signing. Sovereign risk advisors occupied 4 floors of a building overlooking Boston Harbor and the financial district. Understated elegance. The kind of professional environment where serious people make consequential decisions. During the signing ceremony, Lauren introduced me to their anchor client, the Massachusetts Pension Reserve's Investment Management Board, overseeing $95 billion in public pension assets. Their chief investment officer, a thoughtful man named Levi Coleman, shook my hand with genuine warmth. "We've been following your situation at Crest quite closely," he said. "Impressive contract architecture and execution. We're looking forward to working with someone who understands that regulatory compliance isn't a software subscription. It's institutional knowledge that requires decades to develop properly." 6 months later, sitting in my new corner office on the 19th floor overlooking Boston Harbor, I received a call from Aiden Wu. He departed Crest 3 months after my resignation, along with 6 other senior managers who'd recognized the organizational trajectory. "Tinsley thought you should know," he said. "Crest just lost the New York State Common Retirement Fund account. They cited concerns about compliance infrastructure continuity in their termination letter." I wasn't surprised. Once institutional confidence fractures, it propagates through professional networks like cracks spreading across glass under pressure. "What's Carter doing currently?" I asked. "Last I heard, he took a position at a boutique consulting firm in Austin, Operational Strategy Consulting. Apparently, he's become extraordinarily thorough about reviewing employment contracts before recommending any personnel restructuring." We both laughed. Sometimes, the most expensive lessons create the most lasting behavioral changes. That evening, I called Logan at Cornell. He was in his final semester of sophomore year, already planning his summer internship at a quantitative hedge fund. "Mom," he said, "my finance professor keeps mentioning that article in the Wall Street Journal about you and Crest. People in my study group keep asking if you're, like, wealthy now or something." "We are financially secure, sweetheart," I told him. "Your tuition is covered completely. Your father doesn't have to worry about finances. That's what matters most." "But are you happy?" he pressed. "I mean, genuinely happy with how everything turned out?" I looked out my office window at Boston Harbor, then at the framed photograph on my desk. Jacob, Logan, and our rescue dog Cooper, laughing in our Brooklyn backyard last summer. "Yes," I said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing work that matters with people who understand what that actually means." These days, when I walk into client meetings, nobody questions how much I cost. They ask how much risk I can identify and mitigate. They ask what I see developing that they don't. They ask for my professional analysis, and then they actually implement the recommendations. That difference, I realized, mattered more than $11.4 million in accelerated compensation ever could. Because ultimately, this was never primarily about the money. It was never about revenge or vindication or proving a point. It was about being valued for who you are, respected for what you know, and compensated appropriately for what you protect. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything you've built over 14 years to truly discover what you're genuinely worth. And sometimes, if you've prepared carefully enough and documented thoroughly enough, the system protects itself through mechanisms designed precisely for that purpose. Carter Wells taught me an important lesson that morning in the conference room, though not the lesson he intended. He taught me that people who view you as a line item to eliminate are exactly the people you should never work for in the first place. And when you finally find people who see you as the solution instead of the problem, people who understand that institutional knowledge can't be replaced with software subscriptions, that's when you know you've made the right decision. 18 months after my departure from Crest Global Solutions, the company announced a merger with a European financial data provider. The transaction valued Crest at substantially less than pre-merger projections, with analysts citing client attrition in key institutional segments and regulatory compliance infrastructure concerns as contributing factors to the valuation discount. Carter Wells' LinkedIn profile now lists his tenure at Crest as lasting exactly 9 months. His current position description emphasizes strategic advisory services without mentioning operational restructuring. Lydia Vance departed 6 months after the merger closed, taking a position at a mid-sized technology company far removed from financial services. Her farewell message to staff mentioned different operational philosophies between the merged entities. Simon Foster, the general counsel who'd opened my resignation envelope that December morning, reached out privately last month. We met for coffee in Manhattan when I was in the city for a client meeting. "I wanted to apologize," he said, stirring his espresso without drinking it. "I received your memo. I read it, and I filed it away, thinking it was procedural noise rather than an actual warning. That was negligent on my part." "Did you learn from it?" I asked. "I now personally review every executive protection clause in our employment agreements. And when someone with institutional knowledge sends a warning memo, I schedule an immediate meeting to discuss implications, rather than filing it away." "Then something valuable came from the experience," I smiled. "Sovereign Risk Advisors has grown by 40% since I joined. We've added 12 institutional clients, including 3 of the largest public pension funds in North America. Our compliance architecture is now considered the industry standard, and I've been invited to speak at regulatory conferences about building sustainable institutional knowledge frameworks. Jacob jokes that I should write a book about corporate contract negotiation, but I prefer keeping these lessons within professional circles where they'll be understood and appreciated properly." Last week, a young compliance analyst at one of our clients asked me for career advice. She was 26, smart, ambitious, worried about being viewed as just a compliance person, rather than someone contributing to business growth. "Let me tell you something important," I said. "The people who don't value what you do will never understand it until it's gone. Your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to build something so structurally sound that its absence becomes immediately catastrophic. And then make sure your contract reflects that reality." She looked uncertain. "Isn't that kind of adversarial?" "It's protective," I clarified. "For you and for them. The right people will never trigger those protections because they understand the value. The wrong people need those protections to prevent their own worst decisions." That's perhaps the real lesson from everything that happened at Crest. Good contracts don't create adversarial relationships. They create clarity. They force organizations to confront the actual value of institutional knowledge before making careless decisions. They protect both parties from circumstances where emotion or efficiency metrics override strategic judgment. When Carter Wells stood there, pointing at my compensation, seeing only a number that looked large in isolation, not the systems or the institutional knowledge it protected, his mistake cost Crest $1.5 billion. My preparation ensured I walked away with exactly what I'd earned and exactly what I deserved. And perhaps most importantly, it taught me that the best professional revenge isn't vindictive or emotional. It's contractual, documented, and entirely self-executing. So I'm curious, what would you have done in my shoes? Or have you ever had a moment where you knew your value, even when others didn't? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your take.